They were found in places where the land kept its own counsel: rolling hills, stone-fenced fields, a ribbon of road that darkened early under hemlock and oak. In the churches raised by those hills, Quaker plain, Presbyterian sturdy, Lutheran modest, there were boxes and pouches and gilded vessels that drew breath without lungs, that seemed to hold a hush when opened. No one could say with certainty where the relics came from. Fewer still asked. The faithful knelt. The elders kept the keys, and, over half a century, the congregation learned to name the miracles, but not the makers. The makers arrived in 1742, English-born and careful. Nathaniel Whitmore spoke softly and admired things fashioned to last. He brought chalices that took the light like water, communion plates that held a sheen like winter noon, Bible covers whose tooling looked like small, obedient vines. His wife Elizabeth never stumbled over a number or a name. Their children rounded the picture: Thomas, grave and willing; Mary and Sarah with steady hands for bills and letters; and William, a pale-eyed boy who lingered in the woods and brought home what the forest could not miss: a spent bird's wing, a fern folded in on itself, the bone-scant skull of a vole. Visitors praised the order of the workshop, the good smell of shavings and varnish, the neatness of tools hung by size. It began with weather and kindness. A widow named Mary Collins, walking home ahead of snow, heard a man call out for help: a lost child, a lantern, the edge of pine where light thins into dark. She turned from the road because that is what kindness does. She followed because winter had closed its fist around the hour. The workshop door shut behind her with a household sound: wood, latch, breath. Later, in a boy's cramped confession, the words buckled: canvas on the floor, a prayer spoken without warmth, hands moving like professionals. The ledger that followed recorded nothing of her voice, only value, recipe, destination. They perfected the craft in the rooms below the light: salt and alcohol and herbs, a drain set in stone, hooks that took weight without complaint. Elizabeth sewed the pouches, black velvet edged with gold. Nathaniel wrote the stories of provenance: Rome, Cologne, a martyr whose name wore 3 spellings to fit 3 denominations, and Thomas learned how much silence a son can carry. The merchandise traveled in innocent trunks beside legitimate wares. Church elders met it in back rooms and sacristies, the exchanges fat with courtesy and fear. You will keep this discreet, yes? You will see the benefits are immediate. By spring the whispers began: a bone that healed, a ribbon of preserved flesh that quieted fevers, a box whose presence drew tears from the heart of heart. Faith is a tender chemistry. It requires only a purchased catalyst. Years turned and the work grew confident. Elizabeth claimed a gift she called discernment. The devout and the pure, she said, those made almost luminous by suffering, would yield relics of uncommon potency. Nathaniel, already deep in a theology that bent toward opportunity, did not resist the thought. They watched gatherings with counting eyes. A traveling preacher who stood too close to the door. An elderly woman whose prayers soften men. Someone kind, someone alone, someone whose disappearance could be explained by wolves, by river, by war. The revolution came and taught the country how to believe harder. Churches broken by soldiers needed rebuilding. People broken by grief needed meaning. Shortages made the Whitmores invaluable. They sold what could be displayed and, quietly, what could not. William, whom childhood had sharpened into something bright and unnerving, discovered refinements: how to keep a fragment flexible, how to hold a color the body should not keep. Prices climbed. In February of 1782, an orphan vanished from a church asylum in Philadelphia. 3 months later, a parish prayed before the preserved heart of a child martyr, and mothers swore their babies' fevers fell like wheat. Conscience arrived raw and staggering. An apprentice named Daniel Foster slipped from the property at night with a notebook bound under his coat. In Philadelphia, he found a Quaker minister, Elijah Thompson, who had already begun to follow threads that tugged back, again and again, to the Whitmore door. Foster told him what the cellar smelled like. He told him about the hooks. He told him that prayers were said before the knife, that God was thanked afterward, that the book, listed each acquisition as if it were candlesticks and not a life. By morning the notebook had burned, and by week's end a body in the river wore Foster's boots. Thompson lived, but just a dinner gone wrong, a teacup bitter. a season of illness that taught him which friends were safe to trust. Help came from within. Sarah, the daughter who wrote in a close, neat hand, had learned how to file the receipts of a crime without letting the numbers touch her. 32 years old now, shut off from suitors by a father who called it prudence, she found she could no longer tidy her mind into obedience. In a plain back room of a Quaker bookshop, she told Thompson where the trapdoor lay, how to shift the bench, how many steps to the first room. She drew him a map of the underground chambers and said the word archive in a voice that failed. She placed her mother's ledger inside her shawl and held it as if it could bite. Snow came down the night the law came up the lane. Thompson brought a smaller party than he had planned. Weather makes fools of strategy, and knocked with the authority of a man who knows his name will be in minutes whether he fails or not. Thomas opened the door and stood aside, a man already living across a line he could not return over. The cabinet yielded its finger. The bench slid. The boards lifted. The first breath from the stairwell had the taste of metal in winter. Below, the lights made islands. Surgical steel lay ordered by size. Pages were slick with diagrams. Jars held liquids that remembered the fields above them. In the second room, 3 bodies hung, work interrupted. A man, a woman, a child whose smallness cast a larger shadow than the others. In the third, shelves and shelves, each box labeled in a deliberate hand, name, date, destination, and on the table the ledger, heavy as a brick of law. Thomas talked. 81 adults, 22 children, 40 churches, 7 states. Prices, routes, fictions. Mother sees them, he said, those that will work best. She taught William to see it too. They walked at revivals the way butchers walk stockyards. Sometimes, he said, the miracles came fast and useful, and sometimes not. But the money always came. Dawn lifted its pale shoulder at the windows when the men returned from the western edge of the property. One wounded and shaking, one not returning at all. Elizabeth had offered reason, a payment, a promise, a mathematics of piety and benefit. William had offered a blade. They were gone into the pines, boxes carried by hands that knew how to distribute weight. The hunt lasted 3 days and found them in a hunter's hut, lying side by side on a makeshift altar with the calm of those who have chosen their ending. What they had hoped to consecrate with their deaths, no one could agree. The trunks they'd saved held less than they planned and more than anyone wanted to touch. Nathaniel, sick and spent, was given a chair in a courtroom and the time to damn himself. Thomas swung from a rope in May after telling everything he could remember in a voice that no longer argued with itself. The state repurposed mercy into policy. The churches repurposed shame into silence. Records were sealed. Boxes were buried. Some relics were collected and put into unmarked ground. Others were hidden inside the buildings that had once displayed them openly. A few remained where they were, defended by sermons about mystery and the sovereign mind of God. People who lead congregations know the fragility of belief. They weighed the truth and found it heavier than the pews could bear. Sarah lived under another name and did not forgive herself. In a narrow room in Boston, she wrote small letters and gave away larger sums and learned the patience of teaching children their letters. In her last entry, she said she had tried to balance the scales and knew she never had. She died in a plain bed with a plain blanket, the way she had wanted to live before the numbers hardened. The papers slept. Fire ate some. Others were stored behind a shelf by a man with the habit of mistrusting the world's capacity for truth. When at last the packets were handled by hands that did not tremble, the map led to what remained. Timbers dark in the earth, the scar of a filled shaft, the soil's refusal to grow anything of worth. In a Western church, a workman found a hidden niche, a velvet pouch, a letter that dated grief the way a clerk dates a bill. A pastor did the only decent thing. He arranged for a grave and a line of words a stranger could bear to read. Unknown child of God, finally at rest. What legacy remains is a kind of double hunger. In the churches, the hunger to keep believing. In the records, the hunger of truth for daylight. If you stand on a cold evening near the old Harmony meeting house and the wind shifts, you may hear a sound that could be wood settling or could be a careful latch lifted from within. The mind is a generous fabricator. The past is too. But the names survive in ink somewhere, in a ledger that weighed as much as a headstone, in a hand that never rushed even when the blood did. The land remembers what was asked of it, and sometimes, In the narrow moment before prayer becomes silence, the faithful remember to ask where a miracle learned its name.